I don't think there's any way of getting around the fact that if you have a racial group that is disproportionately in a certain line of work and that line of work gets cut back, that group is going to be relatively disadvantaged by that having been done. Is that a reason not to do it? No. In my view, you will do it or not do it, not based on the calculation of what racial groups are going to benefit or not, but based upon an assessment of what the general justification for that work. Otherwise it would be a make work program where you're asking taxpayers to pay for something just because it had a benefit for a favorite population group, and I'm not prepared to endorse that. Fred. Actually, this same Fred has submitted 2 questions, but they are related, so I will consider them together. First, he writes, in general, I'm opposed to DEI, identity politics, etc. There's so many negatives. Discrimination against whites, Jews, and Asians, loss of free speech, ideological takeover of the universities, and much more. However, there must be some positives. 1, more employment of members of oppressed groups in high-paying jobs like DEI administration, thus raising their standard of living and hopefully leading to a better life for their offspring and descendants. And 2, greater attention to members of, quote, oppressed groups. Are there benefits worth considering such that a reformed version of DEI would be worthwhile? Maybe Lawan could weigh in on this. Lawan is my lovely wife, everybody.
The epithet.
We get mentioned here from time to time, and apparently Fred has taken note of her somewhat left-of-center political predisposition, so maybe she could weigh in, but she's not here to answer. Fred's second question, submitted a few days later, is, according to Copilot, which referenced usafacts.org, the demographics of federal government workers shows that Black people are significantly overrepresented in the federal workforce, 18% of the federal workforce versus 12% of the U.S. population, whereas Hispanics are significantly underrepresented. Whites are just slightly underrepresented, and Asians are just slightly overrepresented. It seems likely that those Black employees will lose a significant portion of jobs as a result of the Trump administration reorganization. Was the hiring of so many Black Americans the result of affirmative action? How will the loss of jobs affect the Black community? Why were Black Americans so overrepresented and Hispanic Americans so underrepresented? Should concern for the Black community's influence the way the layoffs are being done? So let me take a crack at that. I mean, the two things are related.
I just want to very quickly ask you a question, because it is you.
Yes.
This is you. For his second question, are you aware that affirmative action played a significant role in the hiring of those Black people in the government? Because I've seen that said, but I don't know the answer to the question. Anyway, go ahead.
No, I actually was going to say I don't think it's true.
Okay.
I mean, I'm not aware of a comprehensive and aggressive at the U.S. Postal Service, for example, or at the Department of Health and Human Services, or whoever the Defense Department, comprehensive initiatives under the banner of affirmative action to try to reach out. I was going to speculate because I don't know. I mean, my honest answer is I haven't studied this in any kind of detail, and I don't know. But I do know that it's a long-standing perception on my part that Blacks are overrepresented in public employment. That's federal, state, and local government. And I was going to offer that one reason might be in the post-World War II environment, and especially before the passage of the civil rights laws of the 1960s, but I expect even after, the amount of anti-Black discrimination in employment decisions that you find in the public sector was less than the amount of discrimination that you might find in the private sector. So rather than calling it affirmative action, I would have thought this deserves to be pursued more seriously as a quantitative investigation, but I would have thought it was the absence of anti-Black discrimination, relatively speaking, in the federal government employment that was the source of the relative disparity. That, and perhaps a preference for the relative preference for seeking jobs in public service or public employment, the security of doing so, the fact that you might have gotten aware of the possibility because others in your network were working in that sector and so on. And then you'd have to get down to specific things like who becomes a postal worker and this kind of thing. But I take the fact. I take the fact reported that 18% or whatever it was of the public federal employees, but 12% of the population as relevant to the
default face to me. Government worker, I think of a black person. Yeah, there is an over-representation. Yeah.
As relevant to the issue of, well, okay, then if you're going to cut the federal workforce, isn't that going to hit blacks relatively harder? Just like if you have DEI, wouldn't you expect that to benefit blacks relatively more? And I think the answer on both questions is yes. I think the public employment question is more pertinent because there's a lot more people involved in those jobs who are going to experience the possibility of or the certainty of layoff or being let go if there's retrenchment. And it's not the end of the world, of course, to get 6 months severance and to have to go and look for another job. It's certainly not a good thing to lose your job, but it's not the end of the world. And I think it's easy to overstate the deleterious consequences of that. But I don't think there's any way of getting around the fact that if you have a racial group that is disproportionately in a certain line of work and that line of work gets cut back, that group is going to be relatively disadvantaged by that having been done. Is that a reason not to do it? No. In my view, you will do it or not do it, not based on the calculation of what racial groups are going to benefit or not, but based upon an assessment of what the general justification for that work. Otherwise it would be a make work program where you're asking taxpayers to pay for something just because it had a benefit for a favored population group, and I'm not prepared to endorse that.
I just want to say that that first observation about the role of affirmative action in that, as opposed to something more emergent, if we're going to have a theme here, Charles Murray tosses off something like that in a kind of a pregnant way. And he writes so many books, I forget their titles. But to be honest, if you have a problem with this thing or that thing that he said, generally Charles Murray is right. He's a brilliant man. And in
I agree with that.
The one that he did 4 years ago about IQ
Facing Reality, I think is what it was called.
Yes, Facing Reality. Yeah. He gets I say this in admiration, he gets a little messy at the end, and he just kind of tosses off, well, one problem with all of this is that because of affirmative action and government positions, blah, 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 blah. And I did a review of it where I said, well, is that true? What is the evidence that affirmative action plays this role? And he wasn't interested in saying so. So this just reminds me of that, because I thought that would be an interesting point if it were true, but I just never was aware where that came from.
Yeah, he has this thing where he says, well, blacks are really underrepresented in the high level of competency on the technical curriculum and the tests and stuff like that. And yet you see their numbers amongst people who do jobs that require those kinds of skills to be pretty close to their proportions in the population. So it's a backdoor inference that it must be affirmative action, since if you were hiring strictly on merit, and if blacks, based on other measures, seem to be relatively underrepresented amongst the meritorious, they would then therefore logically be underrepresented amongst those who are employed.
Okay. So he's deducing it. Right.
I'm sorry, say it again.
He's deducing it.
That's right. I think he's inferring as the most plausible account of the numbers that he's getting of why blacks would be, 10% of engineers, but only 3% of people who score 2 standard deviations above the mean on the quantitative test.
Right.
Something like that.
This is even the case in government, because otherwise the numbers, if these are positions that require some sort of test, because otherwise the numbers wouldn't be what they are.
Now, and you have to take affirmative action maybe as a broadly conceived category, and it doesn't have to have a program of affirmative action. It may be just that, for example, here's a good example, I think. I looked this up recently. When Joseph Biden was president between 2021 and 2025, and he made, I don't know how many appointments to the federal bench, but I think over 200. 17% of those appointments were Black women.
Well, it's obvious that there's an idiot.
Whereas if you look at the proportion of lawyers who are Black women, it's under 3%. So, you got a Murray-esque kind of conclusion that you're going to draw here, which is that some of those Black women are not the most qualified people for the positions that they are being appointed to.
An inevitable conclusion. Well,
I don't take relish in saying that. I'm not trying to cast aspersions on Ketanji Brown Jackson or anything like that. But I'm just saying that's the logic. That's the...
I have some lawyer friends who I've asked about that sort of thing and what they would say. And yes, they have a bias, but these are brilliant people. I had two in particular. They would say that it's a matter of everybody being the same and then choices being made. And I'm not sure that's not true. And so for them, that was the Ketanji Brown Jackson argument. It was that, they chose color, but she was as good as any number of other people. And there you go. Now, 17 is a little bit high a number, but presumably maybe it's that everybody has the same qualifications. And then you start dividing up the pie. And maybe you kind of lean a little harder in fashioning the pie than the actual population shows. I'm just trying to give benefit of the doubt there instead of us saying that, say, for example, Ketanji Brown Jackson wasn't as qualified as other ones. I asked these two people, I said, is there any reason to think that she isn't on some metric as qualified as other people who could be considered? And they're careful thinkers. They can think beyond themselves. And they said, no, in a case like this, that analysis that, what's his name? Who was it who ended up not being able to work at Georgetown because he did one unfortunate tweet saying that she wasn't...
Ilya Shapiro, who is at the Manhattan Institute now.
They disagreed with his analysis on that. And I thought, I'm not in the legal community, but they seem to be...
He says when Biden commits himself to appointing a Black woman to the bench, we're going to get a lesser Black woman. I think that's a quote.
Something like that.
One that got him into trouble.
Yeah.
Now, I've been hanging around law schools for a while. I'm not a lawyer, but I am a professor, and I've taught at Harvard and other places. And I know a lot of really, really smart lawyers. Everybody's not the same. Constitutional law, torts, taxes, contracts. Have you ever tried to read any of these cases and parse these legal arguments?
It takes a lot of G, so to speak. Yeah.
Yeah, man, you got, there's room to grow in the law for intellectually oriented person. And the wheat is going to get separated from the chaff after a period of time. Everybody's not the same. I'm not saying Justice Jackson is not fit. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying everybody's not the same.
I'm trying to think, watching all of them, what are we actually seeing? If you have no bias at all, I would venture to say that from what I've seen, Justice Jackson does harder thinking than Justice Barrett, it seems. Although Justice Barrett also is on the quiet side. But I think I would think that even if I didn't know what color they were.
Did you see Michelle Obama recently? I was, doing more time in social media than I should have. And I found this statement of hers that she was speaking to African-American undergraduates at Ivy League institutions saying...
This is the one where she has the long dreadlocks?
Yeah.
I didn't turn on the volume. What did she say then?
She basically said, don't let them tell you that you're not fit to be here, even if you were a beneficiary of affirmative action. I remember how I felt when I was at Princeton University, and I had to battle a lot of stuff. And one of the things I had to battle was the feeling that I didn't belong because I didn't test very well. And, I don't know what her background was and so ever. But let me just assume that her test scores were lower on average. She's admitting this now. But she said she was just as smart as everybody else. She was a good student. She did well, she said, and she's obviously done well in life. Don't let them make you feel like you don't belong. It's a hoax. She used the word like a hoax or it's rigged or something like that. This idea that meritocracy means if you had a 650 instead of a 720, you don't belong. So... You hesitate, John. I think you're making a calculation about whether or not to say what you really think.
Yeah, I am. And, she and I are around the same age. I didn't do Ivy, but I saw all that. And frankly, I didn't feel it because I'm weird. And those tests for me are child play. I don't know why. But yeah, the thing is that what you're talking about with the law is true across the board of
Yeah.
some. And those tests are not irrelevant. And there's a certain way of thinking, that G way of thinking, that often is the only way to cut the mustard. And creativity and diversity are not going to cut the mustard in any significant way. But there are a lot of people around who are going to pretend otherwise. And I grew up with that in the 80s and the 90s. I'm just going to leave it there.
I'm going to amplify it because I think I know what you're saying, and these are my words, not yours. She did sociology at Princeton, and she wrote a thesis.
I knew you were going to be right.
I've looked up the thesis, and it's mediocre. I'll just say that, and I'm prepared to defend it if challenged. It's mediocre. It's not a brilliant piece of work, with respect. I mean, that's just my opinion.
Wasn't it kind of autobiographical? It was
about being black at Princeton and your identity and how the process of going to an elite place might affect your connection to the black community. And it was to a certain degree kind of anecdotal and autobiographical. The quantitative analysis in that thesis was minuscule or non-existent, and whatever. But long time ago, it was now if she had done philosophy rather than sociology, if she had written a tightly reasoned, obviously erudite, precise, logically detailed and in-depth consideration of some important question.
And the problem
would be different. So then her saying I was just as smart as everybody else and it didn't matter really, and they just, conspired to make me feel like I didn't belong would be more credible. But in fact, I mean, if the statement is it doesn't matter if you're at the head of your class, you can go to a place like Princeton, the opportunities opened up for you for having done so, give you a chance to excel in life as I have done. That would be one kind of thing. The idea that, as you say about the lawyers, everybody's the same basically, and there's nothing that choose between them. I mean, the test scores don't really matter. We're all smart kids here, and it's about who you know, not about what you know. After 50 years in elite higher education as a professor, I'm not buying it.
The hardest thing is that there's this, it all perpetuates itself because a certain kind of white guilt from one corner and a certain sense of duty from the black corner of the professoriate means that someone like her is encouraged to write a thesis where you identify racism and you identify feelings of inadequacy. And whatever the value of those things are, it's not tight reasoning. You don't really have to work that hard to write about how you felt and to talk to a few other students about how they felt and to show that racism persists. It's not that it isn't an important aspect of society, but it's not that hard. Whereas if you're going to do philosophy, you've got to do some reasoning. Kant takes work. Kierkegaard takes work. Aristotle takes work just to understand what the hell he's saying. And so that's different. And I'm going to say it is of a higher order. But if you're black in those environments, often you're almost encouraged not to engage in that higher order kind of thinking. And I'm not going to say that you're thinking of it as white thinking, but you're just considered to be exempt from it. You might not even really know that it exists because you're steered into these more subjective issues. And it's just like, I'm going to say this, getting a little older, although the problem is I don't want to talk about people my age. In my own field, there is an idea going around more and more in linguistics, you're supposed to do statistics. You're supposed to be counting things. It's all about big data. It's beginning to make me feel a little bit uncongenial because I respect numbers, but I don't like them. It's not the way I think. You're now expected, it's percentages and stuff. And sometimes to the point that you're not really thinking about language, but that's the way it is. And so it's getting a little harder in linguistics to do the kind in higher linguistics, the major venues, the major journals, where you're really writing about your feelings. And I've had some people, Black people, say to me that linguistics is racist lately because if you're going to require, these numbers, that's not what we do, and therefore we get shut out. And the idea of saying, well, that's just not what we do, I'm going to leave that there. But the fact is that if you're writing about feelings and even surveying people about feelings, that's not as hard as the kind of linguistics that people are being asked to do. The reasoning isn't as close. And, I want us to engage in close reasoning. But that can be a tough thing to get across these days.
Yeah, and it's a pity too, because that is the future. The future is in the sciences, it's in the technical fields. The 21st century is going to be incomprehensible to somebody who doesn't have a grip on this kind of thing.
AI, genetics. Yeah.
And as anybody with eyes can see, the Asians are all over the School of Engineering and the physics department and the mathematics curriculum and whatnot. And the Blacks are as scarce as hen's teeth in those areas at the elite campuses today.
It's funny, at Columbia, when you get up near the engineering building, there are times when you almost would think you were in Shanghai. There are so many Asians and even not as many whites. But yes, it's clear that they excel in that area or they know what they need to excel in. Yeah, you can't miss it.